Welcome back. I now come to the final half an hour to this lecture. We have in almost the last, I think I've been speaking for already about 3 hours. In the last 3 hours, I've only managed to scratch the surface of the area of law which we generally call conveyancing law, basically land law and land development law. It's merely the surface. It just gives you a guide and hopefully tells you where to look for if you run into any problems. Before I proceed any further, when you hear this lecture, it will be a recorded lecture, but there will be a session for you to ask questions. So feel free to actually record your questions, and then you can ask me the questions during the actual Zoom session or whenever this lecture is being conducted, and I will answer it. I'll try to be online there and then and answer these questions for you. I will now just go through the rest of the legislation which you are supposed to read up and be familiar with before you sit for the exam. All of you would have actually got a list like this, listing down the 24 legislation which you must know. What is very topical nowadays is because Sabah is a state within Malaysia, and Malaysia was created as a result of the Malaysia Agreement in 1963. I think this is something which is very topical and we should probably hear a lot about recently. Under this Malaysian Agreement, which is subsequently enshrined within the Federal Constitution, several aspects of Sabah law is reserved to the state government, one of which is matters relating to resources, which includes land. That's why we have our own land law. That's why we have our own planning law relating to land. Anything relating to land, the laws is reserved to the jurisdiction of the state. The same applies to Sarawak. So that is why we have a lot of our own legislation which you cannot find in Semenanjung. And that is why there's many legislation in Semenanjung or in Sarawak which has no application in Sabah. All relates back to the Federal Constitution of the Malaysian Agreement 1963, and from you learning from the Federal Constitution what is known as the Federal List and what is known as the State List. That's something you should know. One of the legislations which you're supposed to know is the State Constitution. I think there's at least one question on the State Constitution, but the question relates to general principles within the state constitution. It is not technical questions like, once the state assembly is dissolved, how many days before you must call for the election. It's not technical, it's general principles which you must know. We've gone through the Sabah Land Ordinance, we've gone through the Subsidy Title Amendment, we've gone through the Land Acquisition Ordinance. The next one is the Limitation Ordinance. Sabah has its own limitation ordinance, Sarawak has its own, West Malaysia has its own limitation ordinance. Again, if I remember correctly, the question asked, there's one question on limitation ordinance, and it's not a technical question again, like if it's a contract, how many years or things like that. It's for certain principles within the limitation ordinance. For instance, that if the limitation period has expired, what sort of actions were done by the contracting parties which have the effect of extending the limitation period. Principles such as those, the question will be asked on those sort of principles rather than technical issues, whether it's 3 years or 6 years or 12 years. There are no questions on those technical ones. Number 6, application of laws and amendments. I honestly cannot remember what's in it. I cannot even remember whether there's a question on it, but it's a very short legislation. I think it's only 2 pages. Just run through it to know what it provides for. Okay? Remember that this course is to familiarize yourself with local laws and not make you and not examine you as if you're an expert. Administration of Native and Small Estates Ordinance. This is quite an important legislation. I think if you go to Sabah Law.net, it says it's been repealed, but it has not been repealed. Under this legislation, the administration of Natives and Small Estates Ordinance, lawyers will become familiar with a document called the Jadual 3, or third schedule. The best way for me to explain this legislation is to tell you a story. This is a true story regarding a case which I handled personally. This story is about a very young native family in Tuaran. The husband and wife, and they have something like 5 children. 5 of the children, the age difference between each child something like 1 year, so it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. It's very, very young children. They had this beautiful piece of native title just next to the main road. If I remember correctly, it was 2 acres, which is very, very big piece of land. Very beautiful, very ideal location, just next to the Tuaran main road, the temporarily to Tuaran road. So they decide after